Hello, and thank you for being here, everyone. We are rounding up our first week of our 2024 FCI Live series. Thanks so much for being here. And we're having our second session with Sarah Lebherz and Don Moffit of Columinate, who are here to talk to us about understanding and using your pro forma. If you missed their session yesterday on how to look at feasibility and search for feasibility for your project financially, there is going to be a recording of that. Do not miss it. You're really going to make sure you're going to watch it. But I'm glad you're here for this session with us today. Real quick, FCI Live has two champion sponsors this year who've really made this series possible. So we want to thank Columinate and National Co-op Grocers for being our champion sponsors and making today possible. With that, we're going to turn things over to Sarah and Don. But real quick, I know we have a lot of new folks here. So Food Co-op Initiative, my name is JQ Hanna. I'm with Food Co-op Initiative. We are a small nonprofit that only serves startup food co-ops. We're here to do education and support for those communities that are thinking about or in the midst of working on building their own food cooperatives. And then Don and Sarah, if you have not met them before, I don't know if they're going to introduce themselves this way. This is my shorthand. These are the gurus of pro forma. Okay, so everyone works with them, and I will always recommend some of you guys work with them. And the reason is because not only is pro forma work really specific and complicated and stuff, even if you have pro forma skills, I have met people at startup food co-ops who are professionally developed pro formas. That's what they do for a living, and they still work with Don or Sarah. And the reason is because they also bring such very expressed, very detailed expertise on the food co-op business industry. In addition, and how we fund them and how much debt we can handle and what are reasonable margins on top of, and have seen so many of these projects. So they bring both the financial expertise and the expertise of really knowing the experience and what happens with startup food cooperatives and food cooperatives. So I'm going to turn the floor over to them, but I wanted to give them that shout out and just explain kind of who they are and why they're here talking to you. If you're like, talking to any startup food co-op that's further along than you, they are working with Sarah and Don pretty much. Thank you too for being here.
Thank you so much, JQ. I really appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Don Moffit, and with me today is my colleague, Sarah Lebherz. Now, if you were here yesterday, you heard this introduction, but I know some of you weren't. And I want to just tell you a little bit about Sarah. Some of you may have worked with my mentor, Bill Gessner. Bill developed the pro forma model that's the basis of the work that we do today. And he was the first person to provide technical support to co-ops. He passed the torch to me, so to speak, in 2018, and I started working with a lot of startups. Recently, I started looking for someone who could do that work as well. And after a 2-year search and a 1.5 years of us working together, I now have the pleasure of passing Bill's work and Bill's legacy to Sarah. So Sarah grew up in the Common Market, which is a 2-store co-op in Frederick, Maryland. I say grew up there because her parents were part of the founders. She's worked there for the past 25 years. She's run capital campaigns and was the project manager for 2 new co-op stores. She served as a category manager and a general manager, the general manager, and is now the chief financial officer. Bill Gessner was her mentor as well. So she brings a lot to the table, and I'm delighted to be with her here today. So we have some goals for our session, right? And we're going to try to keep this to our allotted time. Well, we have to keep it to our allotted time. But the questions we're going to try to answer in that time is, what is a pro forma? And why do you need a pro forma? Like, what does it actually look like? And how can you make use of it once you have it? So a pro forma is a set of financial statements, right, that look at we try to look at the future. What are the future expenses and revenues? But it also is going to look at the startup costs. And so everything it takes to get to opening day and then for 10 years after that. It's also a tool that lets you, it's interactive, so you can use it if you want to explore ways to get to financial feasibility. And of course, if you're working with someone like Sarah, then they can they do those same explorations with you. Let's see. So why do you need a pro forma? So, I was just talking about a couple of uses of it. One is financial feasibility. So, like, just to find out, like, how is this going to work? One's to assess risk, like how big are the risks? How likely is it we're going to be successful? You want to demonstrate project viability to the owners, lenders, and other funders. So these are all people that you're going to ask, your neighbors, your friends, yourself, are all thinking about investing. And you want to show that it has a real chance of succeeding. And then the pro forma is also going to provide guidance to an incoming general manager. So when you're interviewing a general manager, I always recommend you show them the pro forma and you say, what do you think of all the assumptions that are in here, right? There's margins, there's labor, which we'll talk more about. And, how do you feel about that?
Right, so the pro forma has really 5 main components to it. It's really an Excel workbook, but there's 5 main components that are part of it, and they all intersect actually. Whoops, excuse me there. There's sources and uses, there's a debt schedule, inputs and assumptions, financial statements, and outcomes. And we'll go through each of these in a little more detail, but you can see how they all flow to outcomes. In the beginning of a project, you'll spend probably most of your time on sources and uses and inputs and assumptions to determine what the outcomes are. And financial statements are really a means to that end. They project all the revenue and expenses and model what happens to cash accordingly. So we're going to go over each in a little detail, but sources and uses will be your early stage development plan and will include everything from inception to opening day. So uses being the development costs of the co-op, and everything from all organizing costs to inventory, construction, equipment will include some assumptions in there for fees. All of those costs will be part of the uses. Sources will be where that money's coming from and how are you going to pay for the development costs. So that's going to be your funding plan or your capital stack. And this will include a variety of sources such as debt, grants. It might include member loans or preferred shares if those are part of your funding plan. And ideally, those two should match, right? You should have the sources of funds should match the uses of funds, but not always. Sometimes you might raise funds in excess of uses, but that's usually, at least you want to have enough sources that match your uses. The next component is a debt schedule, and the pro forma will include a debt schedule if any debt is part of your funding plan. And one purpose of the pro forma is to identify risks and the likelihood if vendors will get paid back. So the debt schedule helps model that, but it identifies all debt service, which is interest and principal payments on loans, so they can flow through the financial statements. It'll also include owner loans if those are part of the funding plan. The next section is inputs and key assumptions. This includes schedules of the major areas of revenue and expenses that are part of your project, such as sales, personnel expenses, rent. It'll include some of the biggest operations levers for changing outcomes. So we pull those out of financial statements so that we can schedule those out in a little bit more detail. But our pro formas include blue cells, as you can see in this example here, to where assumptions can be modified. So pro forma, like Don said earlier, it's really an interactive tool. So you can use these areas to forecast what if scenarios. Like in this example here, you're looking at a little snapshot of a sales forecast in a pro forma. And you'll notice here we do an adjustment to annual sales in the first 3 years, where we're adjusting downward, where a market study comes in and gives you a specific sales forecast for 3 years. We do a downward adjustment for those first 3 years because the market study typically assumes mature systems and staffing, and that you have a seasoned general manager, seasoned department staff, but it typically takes several years to achieve that optimal level. So in order to make sure the projections are reasonable, we do a downward adjustment for those first 3 years. And we do that in 2 other places too in the pro forma. This example is showing it for sales, but we also do that for margin and labor. So that's one area that is in inputs and key assumptions in pro formas, will be things like that for sales, labor, and rent, and some of those key areas. The next component of the pro forma is the financial statements. And those are 10 years of financial statements, including an income statement, which are all revenues and expenses for the period of time that's being looked at. In the pro forma, it's done annually, so 10 years of those. Balance sheets that are going to show the financial condition of the co-op at any point in time. It tells us what we have and where it came from. You'll look at the balance sheet to look at what the co-op owns, what it owes in terms of any liabilities and debt, and what it's worth in terms of equity. And then there's a set of cash flow statements also for the same 10-year period of time. And those show the movement of cash. So they show change in cash over a period of time, and they reconcile net income against net cash. And one area we will look at very closely when determining financial feasibility of a project is we're looking at what's happening with cash during the 10-year period of time. And finally, there's the section called outcomes. And this section shows the key financial indicators, and we compare those to specific benchmarks. They're going to include things like profitability, cash flow, and cash reserves. So how much cash is flowing through the organization annually, and is the cash balance building, or is it getting depleted? Certain ratios are on there, and we'll go through some of these definitions shortly, but things like debt to equity ratio and current ratio. So that will all be part of the outcomes section of the pro forma. And we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive looking at outcomes to see what those look like.
So one thing I should tell you right off the bat is that there are many, many assumptions in a pro forma. And generally, when we put in sort of all the sort of base case assumptions, the first draft is usually not great. It's usually awful. And so we're always like looking from there where we're continuing to assess and evaluate how things can be improved. But these three metrics here, cash on hand is just how much cash the co-op has at any point in time. That's one of my favorite ones to look at, because it tells you, like, if the co-op runs out of cash, then the party's over, right? So how much cash do you have at the end of each year? Annual cash flow is like what's happening year by year with your cash. And the reason why this, to me, you'll notice in these top three, I don't have net income. Net income is not one that I think about much at all, because there's so many other things that go into calculating how much cash you have. And then days in cash here is another way of looking at the cash metrics. It's just basically says, well, if you don't do any sales at all, how many days can you operate without before you run out of cash, right? So for example, in year one, there was enough cash at the end of year one to operate for 14 days with no sales. But because cash went negative in year two, so did the days in cash. So here we're looking at some other indicators, although I don't look at net income. People love to see net income, and so we do put it into the outcomes. The problem with net income or profit loss is that it includes depreciation, which is a very large expense, but has but it's a non-cash expense. So if you're like, okay, what does that mean? That's something that, working with Sarah, she's going to spend time helping you understand. What is depreciation? How does it work? So we've got net income or profit and loss, and then we have EBITDA, where this is kind of the core earnings. So this is, we take out interest and taxes and that depreciation number I was telling you about. And this tells you really, it's a really much better indicator of the operating health of the co-op. So you can see that we don't have depreciation in the chart, but but we define it as you take a, like if you spend $7,000 on a refrigerated case before you open, you will allocate a seventh of that over 7 years. That is, there'll be $1,000 expense in depreciation for that case for the first 7 years. So there's something that's really important for lenders that they're looking at. When the pro forma has gotten to where it's working well, then it's going to indicate that the co-op can service its debt. And the ratio here is the EBITDA we were talking about before, the core earnings, compared to the amount of debt service that the co-op has. So what lenders want to see is by year 3 that you have something on the order of 25% more core earnings than you would need to pay your debt service. So when we're looking at all this, we're thinking, do the outcomes show the co-op's going to run out of cash? If the funding plan includes loans, does the financial performance show that debt service can be paid annually? And really big here, does the pro forma support the vision of the co-op? Now, Sarah's gonna switch from here to a limited version of the pro forma so she can go live with you on some of the things that we're talking about.
All right, so did that work?
It did.
Great, okay. So we have a theoretical co-op here, aptly named Gessnerville Food Co-op. And for any of the, I know JQ and Don mentioned earlier that we were all mentored by Bill Gessner. So this is named after Bill Gessner, Gessnerville Food Co-op. So we put this together and, sorry, let me just move a couple things here so I can see this better. Okay. So this includes those 5 elements that we talked about earlier. So we have the sources and uses. Again, the pro forma is really, it's an Excel workbook. So we're looking at that, but we have a sources and uses tab, the debt schedule tab, inputs, financials, and outcomes. And then there's another financial statements, which is a more of a condensed version of the full financial statements. But it's those 5 components put together. And the first one here we're looking at is sources and uses. So again, this is the everything for the co-op from inception to opening day that it takes to start the co-op. So the use of funds is really the bottom section. So it's the development costs of the co-op. And you can see here, we have, we're assuming in this particular co-op that they are renting a space. They haven't purchased a building, but they're renting a space. And that space is maybe like a, sometimes it's referred to as like a vanilla shell or a box, right? That needs a lot of leasehold improvements done to it to become a grocery store. So a lot of plumbing and mechanical and electrical needs. So right now we get some costs that we're keeping the finger on the pulse of how much that's costing nowadays. And that has been increasing over the years for sure. But right now, we're seeing on average about $155 per square foot for leasehold improvements in this situation. So mentioned before that blue cells are in the pro forma, I think are things that can be changed. They're not formulas in there. So numbers can be entered in those areas. So we have $150, $55 a square foot for leasehold improvements. And right now we're assuming that this store size is a total size of 10,000 square feet. So according to that size, we're saying it's going to cost $1.55 million for all the construction. Then we're saying similarly, a square footage amount cost for the equipment. So that's going to be all the refrigeration, all the shelving, the point of sale system, check stands, everything that's needed for equipment for opening the co-op as well. So
Sir,
again, yeah.
I'm sorry. I was waiting for a point to interrupt.
Sure.
Just a little bit to say, if you look at these numbers, this is not what it's going to cost. These are just placeholders.
Yeah.
And for example, you're going to have to, when you find a location, you get a fixture plan, you get an estimate for construction, a rough estimate, and that's going to become the new number in B19. And these are not budgets. These are like not to exceed numbers, right? So you want to come under these numbers as far as you can. And you're going to have to make conscious choices about the kinds of equipment that you're getting, the materials that are being used in construction, the surface materials. So that's all I wanted to say, Sarah. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. Yeah, and as you get more information, so Don mentioned the first draft of the pro forma that we're working on is going to be very assumption level based, right? But one of the things we do with clients is we work continually with you as you make changes and updates and you get new information, and then we'll update that accordingly. So if you start working with a store designer, and from that, you have more information about the equipment that's going to be needed for the store, we'll update it accordingly. Inventory is another big expense that's needed before the store opens. So to load the store with all of the great groceries and produce that's going to be sold. And we have that based at a dollar per square foot amount, currently at $45 for Gessnerville Co-op. So that's equals $306,000. Then there's going to be a lot of fees that are going to be part of the project. So there will be, we mentioned a store designer that you might be working with who's helping with the store layout and equipment selection. You're going to need a pro forma, a market study. Legal fees are going to be certainly for organizing, but also if you decide to do any owner share or owner preferred shares or owner loans, there will be a great, also lease negotiations, all of that. Architectural fees. So we assume that is a certain percentage of those hard kind of construction costs. And right now we have that set at 12%. So we are assuming $402,000 in fees. We're assuming there's going to be a lot of pre-opening expenses, things like personnel. The general assumption is you would hire a general manager about 9 months before opening the store. Because there are so many decisions that need to be made before day one that a general manager is going to need to help with equipment selection. They're going to have to set up the point of sale. They're going to have to work with the vendors and get all of the vendors in line for bringing product into the store. Then they're going to have to decide what that product's going to be priced at. What's the pricing strategy? Going to have to get in the system so that it's priced appropriately and can ring up correctly. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and so that's why the GM needs to be hired well in advance. We assume usually about 9 months, and then they would be responsible for hiring additional staff leading up to store opening. So the majority or the largest number in this pre-opening operating cost typically is the personnel. But there's money in here too for pre-opening marketing and pre-opening administration, which could include things like owner recruitment fees if you're working with printing, brochures, all that kind of stuff. And this, just an idea, this pro forma that we're looking at here is not quite as detailed as the ones, this one's a little bit summarized here. Working capital. We need to make sure there's sufficient funds to be able to cover initial operating cash. So in the beginning, we have to make sure that you're opening with enough cash to cover a few years of losses. So working capital is part of the budget. And then we have an overrun allowance. So this is set as a percentage of the above subtotal in the event that any of these are underestimated, but also if there's any things within construction, change orders or anything like that, unexpected things that come up with construction. So for this co-op, the current total cost is almost $5 million for development. Okay. So we know that then the sources of funds need to be the same. So we need to make sure that the funding plan is at least that $5 million. And initially with the pro forma, we may it's usually early in the stages and your co-op may not know what the funding plan is. That's typical. So we might put something in here as a placeholder for you and give you some insight about it. But really the funding plan needs to come from you and your team, your steering committee or your board, and taking a look at how you think you can raise the money for the project, right? But in this particular example right now, what we're looking at is we have some member equity. So owners have been joining this particular co-op. at an equity share rate of $200, and there's 900 owners. So that is 180,000. We assume that some money is coming from grants and donations, so that's 1 million. We assume that some money is coming from the owners through preferred shares. So 1.5 million is raised in preferred shares, and that they're getting paid a 4% dividend rate annually. Primary loan here, we just have this auto calculating to basically fill the gap. So everything up here totals 2.8 million, and then whatever else, whatever the gap is between that and the total project costs is being filled in with the primary loan right now. So this particular example we're looking at right now is showing a $2.2 million primary loan. So,
whoop, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to comment that there are other places in the pro forma where the board's vision comes into play, but this page really kind of represents the real work of the board or the steering committee. Like, how are they going to raise the money? How can they control the costs?
So we know that now the pro forma also includes a debt schedule. So because this project right now is assuming that there is debt as part of it, a primary loan here, it flows through to the debt schedule, so we can see the principal and interest payments that are required to be able to pay that loan off. And that's here represented as total debt service. So right now, this co-op is, if this were to continue this way, they would need to pay $267,000 annually back to the lender in form of principal and interest. So not only does the co-op need to perform well enough to pay staff, pay rent, pay utilities, pay all of their operating costs, but they need to be doing well enough to be able to also pay this $267,000 in debt service. Inputs. This section, again, as a reminder, are those sort of key revenues and expenses that we pull out to schedule a little bit in more detail. And right now, we have some blue areas where we enter information, and we can play with kind of some what-if scenarios, for example. But right now, we're looking at a leased space of 10,000 square feet. And typically, the sales area is about 65, give or take, percentage of the total lease space. In this particular scenario, the sales area is 6,800, so the back rooms are 3,200 square feet. And we have a market study that projected $800 in sales per square foot. So based on that 10,000 square feet, the adjustment for the sales size is 6.1 million in year one, and then increasing for the first 4 years. And again, here's that downward adjustment that we do for operating maturity, right? So because we're assuming that market study is assuming that you have a seasoned general manager, you have seasoned department staff, that everything is firing on all cylinders from day one. And that's very unlikely going to be the case initially, this isn't just for startups. I would say even for existing operators. We just opened a second store recently, and it can be very challenging even for an existing store to open firing on all cylinders. It's just, there's so many challenges, and getting everybody trained and up to speed and everything is very challenging. So, this operational maturity adjustment is really necessary to bring it into a more reasonable level of sales forecast here. So this is what we actually put in the pro forma, is that the pro forma sales here after the adjustment. Gross margin. So gross margin is going to be everything after you pay for the vendor. So you have sales, you pay the vendor for the cost of goods, and what's left over after that is gross margin. And that's represented as a percentage here as 37.5%. So that 37.5% of sales is what you have now to pay for everything else: personnel and operating expenses, administrative expenses, occupancy expenses, and everything else. So we will work with you and your pro forma to determine from, your vision for the co-op and from the market study, what is the gross margin that expectation that you can expect for the co-op, and we'll help gain a better understanding of that. The second input here is personnel expense, and that is your labor expense. So this one is represented as all wages and benefits. And it's represented as a percentage of sales similar to gross margin, but 23% of your sales will be spent on personnel expense. So all wages, all benefits, all payroll taxes, and all of that. And again, that's an area that we will work with you on when initially meeting with you, talking through your plan, your vision, and looking at, we have a database of over 100 other co-ops that we can look at and compare sales volume with, and target something similar to those other co-ops if you have a similar plan, right? So that's where these initial numbers came from, were similar co-ops here. So right now we have that set at 23%. Rent, obviously we're going to get that from you if you're negotiating an LOI, a letter of intent with a landlord, you have a building in mind, we'll work with that. Otherwise, we'll kind of look at the area and figure out a placeholder until you have a specific building that you're looking at. We have a couple schedules here because we're really looking at cash on outcomes, and we really want to make sure to project accurately. We include some capital investments in the co-op. So initially, you've put, I have to remember how much it was, right? You've put $5 million and a good $3 million into leasehold improvements and equipment. So we're assuming in year one, you don't have to purchase that much more, and you don't have to do that much more improvements to the building, but we're allowing a little bit, right? There's probably going to be some kitchen equipment you might have forgotten, or some program you decide to add. So we want to make sure that we're scheduling accordingly some cash that's going to be used for capital investments. So for the 10-year period of time, we schedule that out here. And one thing you may notice is year 10, the number becomes pretty significant. And that's because most equipment has about a 7-year life. So you would likely be replacing a fair amount of it in years 8, 9, and 10, right? So we want to make sure to include that in your plan, because if we don't, you could be underestimating the amount of cash needed, right? And what the impacts to cash will be for that 10-year period of time. Membership growth. This is adding cash to your organization, right? So you have new members joining, hopefully every day, multiples a day, let's hope. So you've got new members joining, and we're projecting that forward as well. And usually after opening is the most significant growth, and then it kind of tapers off from there. So we have new equity coming in. And then we use an inflation rate to be able to project expenses further throughout the 10-year period of time, which the inflation rate here might look kind of low considering what's been going on lately, but we're really projecting this for a 10-year period of time, which we expect it to level out there. Next up is the financial statements. So we mentioned earlier that there were 3 elements here, but we have a full balance sheet for 10 years. The income statement for 10 years, which will be, sometimes it's called a profit and loss statement, but it's showing your sales after all expenses. We're seeing the net income for this co-op here. So that's after all expenses. And then as Don was talking about, net income might be something he's not looking at as closely, but we're looking more closely at what's called EBITDA, which is the earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, and patronage, because, and I'll point that out here, but there is a very large depreciation expense that's going to happen with the co-ops because you're investing so much in the beginning in those fixed assets, the equipment, and the leasehold improvements. So as Don mentioned, depreciation is something that is, so you bought, I think in his example, he talked about a refrigerator that you paid $7,000 for. So you bought the refrigerator for $7,000. So you had that outlay of cash when you purchased it. But for the purposes of the income expense statement, you're going to spread the expense out over the life of that piece of equipment. So for the refrigeration, a $7,000 refrigerator example, you would only be expensing $1,000 on your income expense statement each year. But it's not actually, hitting your cash in that sense each year. So we add this back when we're looking at EBITDA. So earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, and patronage, we're actually adding back that depreciation. And the depreciation number is the highest you can see here in year one. And that's because not only, did you buy all that equipment and leasehold improvements, but it's also depreciating all of your organizational startup costs in that first year. So equipment depreciates over 7 years, but those startup costs depreciate in year one. So it's the highest here in year one, and then we see it tapers down. So now we're just depreciating equipment and leasehold improvements. By year 8 now, all the equipment is depreciated, and now we're just depreciating the leasehold improvements. Okay. So EBITDA, we can see, even though we have that very large, profit loss or net income loss, our EBITDA, or our current core earnings, actually turns positive by year 2. Okay. So not too bad there from an EBITDA perspective. And then we have the cash flow statement, which allows us to see where cash is going. So we can see cash flow due to operations, cash flow due to those investments, so any new purchasing for equipment and leasehold improvements, and then cash flow due to the equity, so those new owner investments. So we can see what's going on with cash in the cash flow statement. Then finally, we get to outcomes, and this tab is just a summary of some of those key outcomes that we look at, which include the annual cash flow. So we can see exactly how much cash is being lost or gained each year. And in this particular example, cash is being lost every year. And then that cash balance at the end of year, which is negative, right? So by year 10, this particular co-op right now with these assumptions has negative 1.4 million by year 10. And then that core earnings, or that EBITDA that we talked about. Okay. So in this case, we wanted to show you Forma, one, just to show you, all the elements of it, but also to show what it can look like if you do some scenarios with it. So we can see, right, at looking at this, we can see this co-op wouldn't make it, right? It's losing cash, it's burning through cash, year 10, negative 1.4. So a couple of things that we look at initially might go back to the funding plan and say, what does the funding plan look like? Okay. We're looking at that primary loan of 2.2 million. I mentioned earlier about the debt service, right? So if we looked at that debt service, we have $267,000 in principal and interest payments that the co-op needs to make every year. So before debt service, cash flow is actually negative for the first 2 years and then positive in year 3 moving forward. But because of this large amount of debt service that's needed, it's really burdening the co-op and its ability to stabilize cash. So you can see the annual cash flow is negative. So one thing we might look at doing here is reducing the primary loan in some way. And one of those ways could be to increase grants. So if I'm just going to do that here, whoops. So if we increase grants, let's say to 2 million, and now we have 1.2 million in loan. If I go to financials now, you can see that our principal and interest, our debt service now is 150,000. Okay. And if I just flip to outcomes, well, it's looking a little better, right? We have some years in which there's positive cash flow. There's a big outlay of cash in year 10. That's because we assumed those store improvements would be happening in year 10, new equipment and some leasehold improvements. But we're still not quite there. We're still not quite meeting some of the benchmarks. We don't have $150,000 in cash. We did meet EBITDA, right? Our core earnings, we are at 0 by year 3, but we're not going to do well with negative cash, right? So that's where we might go back to the funding plan again and see if we can stretch this a little bit more. So that would be one option, right? What do we think? Or maybe we could raise more preferred shares, or the mix of this is a little bit different. Another thing that we do sometimes is we talk about the store size, because the cost of development is incredibly expensive. So, and by the cost of development, I mean every square foot, because these costs here, $200, $300 per square foot, the more square feet you have, obviously, the more expensive that project is. So we could play with the leased space and lower it and see what that does, right? Because lowering the lease space will lower the development cost. It should lower that loan. That loan was about 1 million, I believe, a minute ago. So we have done that, and we can look at outcomes again, right? Now it's looking a little better. We still have some negative cash, which is not unusual necessary in those first few years. It's positive, but it's still pretty tight here. But it's getting a lot closer, right? We have a positive cash balance. It goes negative in year 10 again, based on some of those large improvements. So this is where we might go back to the funding plan again and take a look at it. But really what we wanted to demonstrate with this is just to be able to see the pro forma, show you some ways to use it to play with some what if scenarios. There's many more that we normally do when we sit down with folks. We really look at inputs. We really talk about margin minus labor, but these are just a few to give you an idea of some ways that we use it to demonstrate feasibility and some options with the project. And I think we're getting close, so I was kind of mindful of the time there, but I think we might take questions at this point. But we really appreciate everybody's attendance, and hopefully that was helpful to everybody.
JQ, we have about 10 more minutes.
Yeah, you guys have 10, 12 minutes, and you definitely have some questions. I have some ones I promised to bring up when we get started, and then we can see what else people add. Tim asked, is there and I know you guys will be the ones that answer this, is there a standard downward adjustment on those market studies that you're using in these pro formas for startup food co-ops?
A standard percentage. This is typically what we use right here. The -18, -12, -6. That is what we generally start with. But I'll say that there's, I'm working with a co-op right now where they have brought in a general manager who has been a general manager at several other co-ops. And talking with him, he is, for example, very familiar with point of sale system. He is going to be using a receiving program that point of sale system uses. So he's very familiar with how to bring some efficiencies to the co-op, and in working through that, and able to understand a little bit about what he's bringing to the co-op, we may make some adjustments to it, but this is what our standard adjustment is.
Okay. I'm gonna throw in one quick comment, which is we had a very successful startup that got a very experienced GM, and so therefore decided to get rid of the discounting of the market study. They hit exactly what their sales would have been if they'd left the discount in. So I am not a fan, no matter how experienced your GM is, but I'll let that go. Yeah. We had a question from the team at North Flint. They asked where those triple net lease costs would hit, and where does that show up in the sources and uses? I did explain it doesn't show up in the sources and uses, but could you show where that is and why it isn't in the sources and uses? So those would be the cost of your lease. Some of you have never heard the term triple net. It just means lease costs for now.
Right. And it would show up on inputs, although this again is a very trimmed down version. So we're just showing base rent here. But you probably have two different things with the lease. You may have what's called a full service lease, which would really be, you know, this amount per square foot that you're paying the landlord, and it's comprehensive of everything. Or what's more typical is you have a base rent amount, which could be like a $15 per square foot, but then you may have an additional dollar per square foot that's covering property taxes, insurance, and things like common area maintenance that you're paying the landlord, and that would be your triple net. But it would show up on your inputs and scheduled out in your financial statements. But if there are triple net expenses that need to be paid before opening, that would show up on your pre-opening operating costs. As we again, this is summarized, but we typically have something here for pre-opening site expenses, which would include utilities, any rent if it needs to be paid before opening, or triple net if they need to be paid before opening.
We have a question here, which this is a tough one. And I don't know you guys, but what you guys think. What parts of this pro forma should the whole board actually understand what you just said? Like, you know, does every single board member need to understand the pro forma to this level? Which parts would you recommend the full board understand versus the one or two people who are going to be working on the pro forma with you?
I would probably say that the whole board should be pretty familiar with sources and uses, absolutely, and outcomes for sure, right? And to a certain level, some of the financial statements, because the board is going to ultimately be monitoring the general manager's performance against the pro forma and against those financials. So I think there needs to be some understanding of, well, these are the metrics and ratios that we're assuming so that the monitoring can happen effectively. But, you know, does the board need to know the nitty-gritty of every single line item in the financial statement? Probably not. But I think in terms of the major metrics and the outcomes, it would be important. And definitely sources and uses, as Don mentioned, you know, the funding plan is going to be very critical. I mean, because, you know, you could be borrowing money from owners, and that's money at risk, right? So the board needs to be really knowledgeable about what is happening with that money, what it's being spent for, you know, the expense of the project, and what are the risks associated with it.
Eric has asked a great question here. How much iterating, how many versions of this end up happening with pro formas, and over how long of a period?
Yeah, that's a great question. Don, I don't know I would say, I mean, sometimes I think we probably end up with like version 20 or something, but I'm not sure if you would have an idea of how many you've come up with.
Well, yes, I mean, I think there are times when I've had that many. When I was the project manager for the Durham co-op market, then I was every time we had an update to anything that was in the pro forma, I created a new version. And the version I handed over to the general manager was 57B.
Yeah.
But we don't make that many updates when we're doing it. You know, we'll collect them and do them, and then each one is dated. Sarah, I don't know if you want to show the where the triple net is, but if you do, you can do that on the last tab, which is the more expanded version, and I think it's so you have this shows kind of the full what an income statement looks like, and there's the triple net expenses, which in our what we're just showing you is just shown as the total occupancy expense. So it's in this section here. And this is what you would see in your pro forma that Sarah would prepare for you. And I wanted to say, I don't know, Sarah, I don't know if you said this, but the question about the board, if you did, I missed it. Board and knowledge of the pro forma, the co-op should have a finance committee, and the finance committee should be intimately familiar with the pro forma and should, you know, ensure that Sarah has explained it carefully and clearly so that they can understand the entire pro forma. And some board members are going to be good at marketing, so don't make them understand everything.
Right. And we will typically a lot of times do sessions with the board so that there is at least a general understanding of it.
Although I will support Sarah in saying that all board members should at least understand the sources and uses tab and the outcomes tab, if bare minimum. And that is doable, even for those of you who right now who eyes are glazing and you're terrified. I promise.
Also, one thing that Sarah hasn't mentioned is that there'll be a call when she shows you the first draft of the pro forma in even more detail than she did just now. But accompanying that first draft of the pro forma will be a transmittal memo that's going to be full of explanations about what the assumptions are, why they're the way they are, how the pro forma works. So there's depending on one's learning style, you can read a memo, participate in the call, so forth. We worked really hard to try to help people understand it.
Yes.
I think we've covered everyone else's questions, but I have one if you guys are willing. Can we go back to the overrun allowance? Because I just want to take a moment and ask you guys to talk about this, because it's so tempting when you're so hard to raise all the money for your co-op. And you were saying, Don, this is not a budget, this is an outer edge, and people look at that overrun allowance and that becomes like, well, we just don't need to raise that money, or we can use that for this. Can you just really speak to the importance of it and how you see how you think boards should see it?
Sarah, can I take this one?
Sure.
So if you look at B24, which is the working capital, that's the cash reserves, the co-op, we are thinking this co-op needs to have in the bank the day it opens. So if we have clients who have to cut into this amount of money in order to get the store open, and that means that the runway they have to get this thing off the ground becomes shorter and shorter and shorter. So we try to be conservative in our approach. And if you if you take the cost overrun allowance out, and then you have an unexpected high inflation, then you're practically dooming the co-op from the beginning. So you really need to look, in this case, at this moment, this $4 million, and say, okay, that's what, before we go all in, before we obligate the co-op, we got to have a plan for raising in this case, $4.1 million. And then if you can do the project for $492,000 less, then you've got a really long runway. You can make some decisions about, do we want to go ahead and pay some debt back? Do we want to hold all this so that if sales go south for a while, we're still good? It gives you so many more options. Sarah, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I was just personal anecdote, I guess. But one of the first project that I was project manager for, construction started, and we were, digging the floor of the building for the plumbing, and we ran into shear rock, which was not anticipated in the project, right? So we had to bring in extra equipment. We actually had to use dynamite to break up the rock, remove the rock. It added time to the project. So there's also just those unexpected construction things that happen that money is very important for. Fortunately, we used up every dollar of our overrun allowance for those types of things. So yes, I would agree in cautioning removing that, because change orders are big, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys for speaking to that, because I think that's the thing, is people get close and they're like, well, now we can touch it. And there are so many stories from so many of us who have project managed these projects from other startups where something unexpected happens during construction and the whole co-op could have been lost if that money hadn't been there to save that unexpected thing. Erica asks if 15% is standard. We have time to answer just that.
We're showing assumptions that are typically used in the early iterations.
Yeah. So there might be adjustments, but that would be to your personal pro forma through your process working with Sarah.
Your mileage may vary. Right.
Yeah. Evan says overrun allowance equals buffer. Yeah, sure. Yeah. In simple English, yes.
Right.
Yes.
All right. We're going to wrap up just a second here. Any last thoughts either of you want to share before we do that? No?
Oh, well, I was just looking at Dana's question here, which is
Yeah, I was reading
somewhat
that.
complicated. And yeah, we start by just talking about personnel costs as a percentage of sales. But like the store that Sarah's talking about with the experienced general manager, he's now putting together like, here's my plan. Here's how many people I'm going to have working in the deli and the amount that I'm going to pay them. And so you know, we have to, or they're working with Sarah to adjust the pro forma accordingly. In the early days, though, you don't do that. So I'll leave it at that for now. Gross margins is just as complicated.
Right. Yeah, we could go into more depth about that. I just want to take a second, though. I know everyone says at the end of these are like, this could have been a 3-hour session. And we know, and thank you for being patient with us for making these so digestible chunks. And thank you so much to Sarah and Don. They created a special version, a little simplified version, so we could get through this today. We really appreciate your guys' time and expertise. So we have one more session coming up tonight, and I don't want you to miss it. Supporting neurodiverse staff and customers. Gabby Davis from National Co-op Grocers is a really amazing speaker. You're going to want to hear her sessions. Always really make you think. They're fascinating. We hope you will join us tonight for the conversation with her. And we have 11 more sessions coming up next week. So go to our website, check out what's available next week, and register to join us. Thank you again to all of our sponsors that have made today possible. Columinate, National Co-op Grocers as our champion sponsors, but so many others also stepped up, and we are so grateful to them.